All right, welcome to December's Stock and Flock Talk. Today we have Dr. David Frame. He's our poultry extension specialist with Utah State University, and he's going to be talking about the Utah game bird industry and how sort of the extension programming that's available for them. And anyway, Dr. Frame, take it away.
Well, thanks, Dr. Rude. Today we're going to talk about something that may be the best kept secret in Utah. I don't think we've got a lot of folks that understand this industry, and yet it is a big, significant part of the livestock industry, I guess, and poultry industry in Utah. And to begin with, what I'd like to do is first define what game birds are. There's a lot of confusion on this thing. And first of all, that is a game bird. That's the pheasant. And in fact, quail are game birds. But that fighting cock over there is not a game bird, and people get this confused a lot. And so hopefully that'll help. But on the other end of things too, is I used to raise exhibition poultry years ago, and this kind of is a sore spot with me too, is that exhibition poultry are raised to show. So this black rosecomb hen, she's an exhibition chicken. These white Plymouth Rock pair here are also exhibition chickens, and even this Goshen turkey is an exhibition chicken. But that fighting cock right there is not exhibition poultry, and yet USDA continues to classify that as exhibition birds, and it's a very confusing and very insulting thing to the exhibition poultry industry. But so what we're talking about today are not fighting cocks. We're going to be talking about game birds, and they're the kind that are raised for hunting. So to put in perspective a little bit, these are the top pheasant states in the nation, and you can see that the upper Midwest is very popular for pheasant hunting and pheasant raising. South Dakota, Wisconsin, and Minnesota particularly, and also Pennsylvania and Ohio have a big stake in this, as well as Kansas. Now, the quail industry is pretty much centered in Texas, Alabama, Georgia, and North Carolina. We don't have a big quail industry here in the state of Utah. However, there is, I would call it kind of a minor part of the game bird industry compared to the rest, but there is some. So in Utah, we have pretty close to 500,000 game birds raised annually, and I think it's growing in popularity, and that accounts for 500,000 pounds or dollars at least of feed purchase to feed these birds out, and over $5 million in potential end user value. Now, what I mean by end user value, and that's the actual birds that are hunted. This does not take into consideration rentals for dogs or for membership fees for hunting clubs and things like that. And so you can see that it's a pretty substantial industry that we have here. There's some game bird hunting anyway in most of the counties. However, the largest, as far as I can figure out at this point, the largest game bird breeder operation west of the Mississippi River is situated in Juab County, and so that's something that we need to be proud of. We need to recognize that, and this particular hatchery, Sutherland's Hatchery, produces game birds for many end users throughout the state, throughout the Intermountain West. And there are also breeders in Emory, Utah, Box Elder, Millard, Weber, Duchesne, Washington, probably others too, but these are the main ones. Here in Utah, the main birds that are raised are the ring-necked pheasant and the chukar. There's also other species, occasionally the Reefs pheasant. Red leg partridge has been imported into the United States by McFarland in Wisconsin, and I'm not sure if any of them have made it here to Utah. They're very similar to a chukar. These birds are raised or originate in France and the Iberian Peninsula. Here in Utah, we have the California quail. The producers call them valley quail, and that's probably our largest quail hunting species. And occasionally we even get folks that raise a few bobwhite quail. And now bobwhites will not survive in this climate over the year, but there are a few that still hunt those. And also there are kind of backyard producers that contract with the Division of Wildlife Resources for providing them with pheasants for release. And then they go out in certain areas and turn these things loose. And mainly it's ring-necked pheasant that they're concerned with. And they have specific things that they want with these birds, and I have helped them get some of the grower information and checklists and things that they need to do, because sometimes they're dealing with folks that aren't professional game bird producers. So let's just take a look at the industry itself. There's three main components of them, not including the end user. But the breeder flocks, they're the ones that maintain the flocks for egg production, and they operate a hatchery. And so these hatcheries will hatch the chicks and then send them out to end users. And this can be either a raise for release, a terminal producer who buys the hatched chicks. They grow them to market age. It takes about 16 to 18 weeks to raise a pheasant out, and so they will raise those out and then turn them loose on their preserve or whatever they've got for the hunters to go ahead and shoot them. And then there's also the hunting preserve, which is just kind of a high-end type terminal producer. Sometimes these are hunt clubs. They will often buy mature birds for harvest, and they can do this either from a raise for release facility or directly from a breeder. And other things may be involved in this, such as membership, and may provide lodging, meals, and dogs. And all this is for the end user, who is the hunter. So we kind of have all of these in Utah. Not necessarily too many of the high-end hunting preserve types. There's places in Idaho and other places that have some of these high-end things, but that's kind of the situation. And mainly it's from the breeder flock to the raise for release folks. Again, the main type of pheasant type of bird that we have in Utah is the pheasant. And there are different subspecies or strains, I guess you could call, of pheasant. And I'll maybe describe those here in a minute. Well, maybe I'll just do it now. These birds will weigh the cocks will weigh about 2.5, 2.7 to 3 pounds each. And the hens are about a pound lighter. And they have what's called the Kansas blueback. A Kansas bird is one that's developed. It's very flighty, wild. It's lighter than the Chinese ringneck, but it flies a lot better, and a lot of hunters like that because of the sport. And they'll average about 2.5 pounds on the males. And then there's also some melanistic mutants and some Manchurian crosses that McFarland raises in Wisconsin that have found their way to many states. And wouldn't be surprised if they haven't found their way here too. They're a fairly good strong flyer too. So here we have a bunch of pheasants out here, and I think we've got some Kansas bluebacks in there, but I'm really not sure after looking at these a little more. That one could be. That one's looks a little heavy to me. It's probably just a regular ring neck. That one. Here's a melanistic mutant, and those things are black to real dark blue colored. And there's a certain segment of the hunters that like those. And we actually have a Reefs pheasant in this group too. So there's a lot of different kinds. And then the next in popularity that we have are the chucker partridges. And these birds are a bugger to raise in captivity. For some reason, they just are a nuisance as far as disease type of things go, but they'll average about a pound. And being the veterinarian that I am, I can't get by without showing you a couple of diseases. So later on, we'll show you some diseases, and most of these come from the chuckers. It is kind of interesting that I did a research project with the DWR on the wild feral chuckers out on the West Desert to look for parasites in the blood and in the intestines, and they're basically clean. But you get this species of bird in captivity where there's high density and there's some problems, but they do make a good hunting species. The Reefs pheasant is occasionally used for hunting. Hunters like the long tail that these things have, and they don't fly very well or fast, so they may be not quite as sporty as the ringnecks go, but they are a very colorful species of pheasant that are used for hunting. This is the red leg partridge. Now, again, they may or may not have made their way to Utah, but it's just very similar to the chucker and in weight wise and everything like that too. The California quail is the most popular quail that's raised in captivity for raise and release. Again, the producers often call these things valley quail, and that's what they're talking about. And the bobwhite, as I mentioned, is not a native species around here at all, and it doesn't thrive very well, but as a raise and release species, there are some small pockets where this is used if the growers decide to have so. Now this one is very interesting. The story behind this is actually a white mutant pheasant that was developed by Bill McFarland. It is the type that is used for meat. So white pheasants is very similar to raising turkeys, and there's been a market developed for these pheasants in the airline business for high-end restaurants and things like that. Farland pheasants own the birds, and if you remember back in a few years ago when we had the high path avian influenza situation that was devastating the Midwest, Janesville, Wisconsin is just a hop, skip, and a jump away from that. And in order to protect his grandparents' stock and his breeder stock, he had some of these sent out to Hat Ranch in Green River, which is out in the middle of nowhere. And so you're not going to get an avian influenza outbreak in a place like that. And so Royd had these for a while. They're very interesting, but they're very mean too. You go in there and they rip the boots right off you, but just makes your mouth water to see the breasts on these things. They're really a nice pheasant. They've since gone back to Wisconsin, so we don't have any here. Here, what I'd like to do now for the next few minutes is just walk you through a typical situation that from the breeder flock through the hatchery, and then what happens after that. So it gives you kind of an idea of what's going on. Now, breeder flocks these are raised outside here, but they're becoming more and more popular to start raising breeders indoors, similar to turkeys, and we have some of that technology going on here in Utah too. This one is still the old conventional way, and some of the things that you'll notice here, first of all, is there's netting over everything. Of course, you've got to hold these birds in, and so netting is very important. You'll notice some lights. They'll light these birds at a certain time. These are mature cocks and hens, and they'll light them usually in January, start getting them into production at that time. And you'll usually have about one cock to, maybe 10 to 15 hens in these groups. And you'll notice these egg huts here. That's where they lay their eggs, and there's about 75 hens per hut. And so this means you should be gathering your eggs very often, very frequently, and even up to 8 times per day to gather these eggs to keep them, from getting dirty and so forth, and broken and things, especially in inclement weather when you've got mud and stuff out there. And so they'll gather the eggs out of here, and here's another picture of a breeder flock. And a couple of things I want to point out here is that netting and bad weather, particularly snow, do not go well. And the producers have to be on their toes all the time on the weather and what's coming through, because if you get a snowstorm, you've got to go out there and drop these nets. And if you don't, it'll collect a lot of snow that will drop themselves, and they'll cause all kinds of problems, and not only break poles and collect on the nets and knock the nets down, but you can have some mortality with your birds too if they're caught underneath that. So snow is not the friend of game bird producers. Another thing I wanted to mention here is you can see that in this particular case, the footings for that fence is pretty shallow, and you'll get rodents through there, but you'll also get things like raccoons and even skunks that can get in these pens that cause all kinds of problems. The skunks will eat the eggs, the raccoons will eat the birds, and they can bring in a lot of disease too. And so if you're building pens, you want either a real good construction wire of some sort or concrete that will go down about a foot or so to help discourage any burrowing underneath there. So now you'll notice that there's no cover in these pens. This is a breeder pen, and if this were a grow out flight pen, there'd actually be rows of material, usually kochia, lamb's quarter. In some areas of the country, they'll even use rows of corn to give the birds cover. And I don't have a good picture of that, but I'll mention that here again in a minute. So you gather these eggs up, you sort them as to what make sure you get the dirty ones out and that type of thing. A typical pheasant egg is going to weigh about 28 to 35 grams. And a chucker egg is a little bit less than that. It's about 16¼ grams. And so you take these eggs in and wash them through a washer. Now this is an old turkey breeder washer, so I'm very familiar with these. When I was working in the turkey industry, had to monitor the wash water quite frequently in these type of things. And so they go through this washer, come out the other end, and then they're racked up in trays that are getting ready to be put in the incubator. And we have about 6 flats per tray, about 46 eggs per flat, and about 276 eggs per total tray. So that tells us that on a cart we have about 26 trays, which is just over 7,000 eggs that would go into the incubator. And of course, that depends on the size of the incubator. But this is a pretty standard nature form type thing. So if you it's actually better to hold these eggs for a day or two, and you put them in a cooler room at 55 degrees Fahrenheit for a couple of days, but you want to get them set and incubating as soon as possible, because they start losing viability after 7 days of storage. But if you put them directly in and start, there's less hatchability than there is if you let them sit for a day or two, very similar to turkey eggs. So these are the incubators, and there's two ways of incubating these. If you have large clients and have a whole a bunch of eggs that you need, there's the single stage incubation where you put those things in, and those eggs will never come out of that incubator until they're ready for the hatcher. It takes about 23 to 24 days incubation for pheasant eggs, and just one more day than that for chuckers. However, there's also multi-stage incubation where you could have as many as 3 different ages of eggs in an incubator, and that has its advantages and disadvantages, because then you have to open them up, take certain eggs out, put some more in, and if you did have a Pseudomonas problem or something in that particular incubator, you've got a bigger challenge of being able to clean it up. Here's an incubator showing that that those racks are in there. They'll automatically tilt those eggs. You'll shoot for about a 99% or 99-degree Fahrenheit reading with about a 51% relative humidity. This thing hasn't quite got up there to where it should be at this point, but these were probably just set. Again, pheasant eggs have quite a bit of variability in what they look like, and so when you cull them out, you want to make sure you don't get any rough-shelled ones or ones that are really white that might have a thin shell and that type of thing. So when they're ready to come out of the incubator, and they'll take them out at day 21. Let's pretend that this is actually a rack that was in the incubator, and it would be full of eggs. And so the hatching trays have to be free of these, these firm things that hold the eggs in, because the chicks would fall out. And so you put a full flat on here, you put this hatching tray over the top and this mechanism, and then you'll take this and turn it, and then it'll put all the eggs into a hatching tray, and then those trays go into a hatcher. So you have about 2 trays per hatcher tray. And the reason you do that for is because you want to maintain egg contact in there, and it just helps with hatching. You get an even hatch that way. So as we go into the hatcher, now this is Jay Sutherland's hatchery that he just built a few years ago. Built it basically from scratch out of a Quonset building. He asked me to come out there and help him design it, and with the airflows and things like that. And so what we're doing is we're actually looking south into the hatcher room. Behind us would be those incubators that we were just looking at. And so they wheel those carts full of eggs into the hatcher room, and then these hatchers maintain temperature at about 97.8 degrees thereabouts, and about 83% relative humidity. And if you do the math, that's similar to the relative humidity that would be in the incubators. So they go in these hatchers for a day or two until they hatch, and then they usually pull the hatch at late on the 24th day or early 25th day. And there's just a couple of more hatchers to look at. And I did not have a picture of the chicks in the tray, so I stole this one off the internet this morning. It's a very poor picture, but basically what you have here is the trays full of chicks. They come out. You've got workers in there that pull these chicks out of the trays and sex them and deliver them. And some producers want straight run, others will want either all hens or all roosters. And these chicks are then put into these boxes for shipping, and they can either be mailed or they can be transported somehow. Um, the breeders here will oftentimes just fill a trailer up and take them wherever they need to. They can go as far as Oregon. And you have about 35 chicks per quarter in these boxes, and there's so you have a total of about 140 birds, I believe it is, per box, which is more than turkeys. Turkeys you'd have about 100, but these are a little bit smaller, and you take them and away you go. And you probably wonder, how do you tell the females from the males? Well, there's a way to do that, and it doesn't require cloacal sexing. And I actually went to Wisconsin and learned how to do this, and so you can get about a 90% accuracy rate once you get into it. Okay, so now we're going to talk about the grow out, and I don't have a good picture of a grow out with the vegetation and everything in there, but again, you've got the same problems. Usually grow outs are bigger, and you've got about 30 square, well, let's see, you've got about 30 square feet per bird in the breeders, and then when you move them out at 6 to 8 weeks of age from the brooder itself, I didn't show you the brooder, but for time's sake, they're in a brooder and then they come out into the grow out. If you peep them, peeping means that you put on these blinders so that they don't cannibalize each other and eat each other up, and so they can't see straight ahead, but they can see peripherally. And that will help a lot in keeping mortality down from cannibalism. You give them 25 square feet per bird, and if they're not peeped, you've got to double that and give them at least 50 square feet per bird. And you better have some good cover in there too when you do that. And here's just an aerial view of some old pens that aren't full right now, and but you can see that the pens are usually deeper than they are wide, and then they'll have rows of kochia. Usually in this part of the country, that's what we'll use is kochia inside those pens. Then they have the same problem with the netting all over the top. So you can see that if you have a lot of square footage under there, you've got some worries when bad weather comes in. The chuckers can be raised just a little bit differently. Here's a breeder flock of chuckers, and it's kind of in their own environment, and so this is kind of how they're raised. It's good to have cover with chuckers too, but you've got to do some heavy pen walking and making sure that you don't have any dead birds or dead plant material and stuff in there too, because they seem to be a little more susceptible to botulism than the pheasants are. And so I did mention that they do have some diseases, and the wild ones, you just don't see it, but you get them in confinement, and coccidiosis is a real problem, and it's very specific to the chuckers. As you probably know, the coccidial species are very species specific, and so you can have some problems, but it's come to the point where chucker and coccidiosis are synonymous terms as far as I'm concerned. And as I mentioned, we do have to get into a little bit of the pathology here. And what you'll see is very thin-breasted chuckers. You'll notice the enlargement of the intestines. And if you look at it under a microscope, you can see the oocysts. And one thing that I do with my biannual meeting is we set up microscopes and try to teach the growers how to do this, particularly if they have a lot of chuckers, and do it at home. Microscopes aren't that expensive, and then we go through some positive and negative slides and try to help them learn, the ones that want to, because this is something that you kind of have to keep control over. Another one, believe it or not, is histomoniasis, and that's blackhead, and it's not only a bane to the turkey industry, but to the game bird folks as well, and particularly chukar raising. And you can see these target lesions in the liver. I can't go to the Target Superstore anymore without thinking of blackhead, because I think of these target lesions. But if you have target lesions and an enlarged cecum, you can pretty much bet you got a problem. And you open that up, and the cecum is very enlarged, thickened, mucoid stuff in there. And the scary part about it is there's really nothing you can do about it. There's no legal drugs in the United States to treat this. And I've seen case after case of these, and you think, okay, well, I'm going to clean up the pans. You can move them around. I actually saw a case of blackhead where they had put canvas down and raised the chukars on the canvas, and they still got it. And so occasionally these flocks will happen, and you just have to take your licks, unfortunately. And the other one is botulism, and you go in there and see some of these birds down. They can't raise their head very well, and they're often treaded on by their flock mates. And what you need to do is start going in there and pen walking, making sure you get all the dead birds out of there, any plant material that's dying, particularly in the summertime when the fly cycle is very short, because these birds are getting the maggots basically. You actually have to watch where they get their water too, and sometimes you have to put it up on wire so that they can't get access to the moisture underneath there. And the toxin is very lethal, and it doesn't take very much. And often what you'll go in there and see is a few dead birds, but you'll often see some of them that aren't dead yet. So they're not getting a lot of it, but there's a problem somewhere. And so for some reason, the chukars just seem to be a little more susceptible to it. Interestingly, you can take these birds, put them in a sick pen, and some of them will recover too. So then we have, this is one of our game bird symposia down at Green River, where they're going through and showing us some of the cover that they use for their raise and release areas. And so down at Green River, it's really very good because there's nothing but desert on all sides of this area, which is down by the Santa Fe River. So the natural geography will keep anything raised and released out. Some of these places will oftentimes charge you to come out and hunt. And like I say, they may have dogs available, but also depending on the owners, they'll do it in different ways. But you may have to be charged to come on the place, and then you tell them, okay, I want to shoot 10 pheasants, 10 cocks, 10 hens, whatever, and then they'll release those pheasants out there. Then you shoot them, and then you pay for the birds you shoot. And they're not cheap. It's anywhere from $15 to $25 a bird, depending on what it is. And then if you want them to skin and gut them and everything for you and dress them, that's extra money too. And so there's a lot of money to be made in this business. And of course the end result of that is just the satisfaction that hunters get that they shoot these things. And I often joke with Roy down there that I help him keep the birds alive so others can kill them. But it's a very lucrative business if you've got the land and ability and the patience to do these type of things. So what's our role as extension? I think as far as the county extension goes, just find out who raises game birds in your county. Like I mentioned, this large producer in Utah is out there, and there's probably not a lot of people who know that. Establish a relationship with them, and assist where you can. But I'll tell you one thing: most of your inquiries are going to be because birds are dying, and so be sure and there's my number right there, and get a hold of me. And there's been times when I've gone out with the county agricultural educator out to flocks and problems in the counties. And so if there's ever a situation, if we ever get out of this coronavirus situation where I'm traveling again, and I get calls from the counties, I always call the county agent, make sure that he he or she understands I'm coming out, and invite them to come too, and a lot of times they will. My role has been over the years is advisory and management, like I mentioned, hatchery management, also continuing education. We have a biannual Utah Game Bird Health and Management Symposium. It's co-sponsored by Utah State University, Department of Ag, and also Hat Ranch has been a great help and sponsorship on that thing. And when I first came, Roy was doing that down in Green River, and we just took that to the next level where we had the funds to be able to bring in people from industry to talk to the growers in Intermountain West here. We get people that come to this conference from all over Intermountain West, and also academic folks too to talk. Again, another part of my position is the disease diagnosis at the Central Utah Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory, and I also help out quite a bit with the Department of Ag on advisory on biosecurity plans, disease surveillance to keep these producers compliant with the National Poultry Improvement Plan, and have them have the ability to get federal indemnity eligibility if by chance they do get high path avian influenza or a virulent Newcastle disease. I've also advised the Department of Wildlife Resources on management guidelines for their contract growers, like I mentioned. The Wild Pheasant Technical Committee had me, invited me to come and give some information on diseases and so forth. And we had wildlife biologists and people involved from all over the country on that type of thing. Again, this happens on odd years. In 2021, we're not going to have it because of the coronavirus situation, which will be the first time in many years that this thing has not transpired. But we are gaining traction with sponsorship every year too. We have feed companies and others that put money into this thing so we can bring folks in. Also, there's a registration fee, and like I say, there's a wet lab that it's my part that I do every year on it. We go through necropsies and look at pathology and stuff like that. So what's the role of the producer? He or she's responsibility is to minimize the probability of serious regulatory diseases. We don't want anything bad out there, and particularly Salmonella pylori and Salmonella typhoid. If you know anything about the history of poultry diseases, they're the two that have really been extremely important in hatchery situations. Also, any high path avian influenza or virulent Newcastle disease. Now, this may not be too important for you, but it's very exciting for the game bird industry, is because just recently, within the last 2 months, the National Poultry Improvement Plan has approved a Subpart J. Now, this actually is something that has to go to who is the USDA agricultural person, United States Department of Ag on it, and it was finally approved so that they're not just pigeonholed into a bunch of other things like with the ostriches and the emus and so forth. So they now have their own program. They are also registered and approved biosecurity plans that our Department of Ag takes care of here, and under the supervision of the Utah State veterinarian. And so that's a thing that they're doing very well. And also the breeders have their high path surveillance submitted to us at the Central Utah Veterinary Diagnostic Laboratory to keep them compliant with their NPIP certification. And then there's such a thing that's called a Secure Poultry Supply Plan. And in the event that we have high path AI in Utah or virulent Newcastle disease, there'll be quarantines put on, and there'll be borders and so many kilometers out from the index case and so forth that everything inside will be completely stopped from movement. But if they abide by the secure poultry supply plan, that will allow them to be able to move live birds and eggs out of control zones and so forth. So since it is lunchtime, I thought I'd just show you a few things that pheasants can do. There's actually a really good recipe cookbook that's put out by McFarland Pheasants that has all kinds of things that fancy dishes that you can do with your pheasants besides just the conventional pheasant under glass that everybody knows about. And I'm telling you, there's three things that are to die for that you can actually buy online. But when I was in Wisconsin, they gave us all these things to try and so forth. But these brats are really good. And there's three types of brats that they make. The original, this beer and cheddar, and another one, I think it was garlic or something. I can't remember now, but all of them are just excellent. This smoked summer sausage is really good. And my favorite is probably these snack sticks made out of pheasant that are sort of like chewy jerky. They're just good stuff. So anyway, there's things that can be done. These aren't Utah products, but there are things that can be done with the game birds on a commercial basis.